Hello, and welcome to Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a podcast hosted by me, Matt Leggett, a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, where I teach utopian and dystopian fiction.
And me, Liam Knight, an independent scholar with a PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham.
In this podcast, we interview scholars, thinkers, and writers from different disciplines, inviting them to discuss what interests them about utopias, dystopias, and speculative fiction.
Whether you're a student, scholar, or someone looking for reading recommendations, we hope you enjoy listening along. If you do, please let us know by rating and following the podcast wherever you are listening, leaving us a comment, or dropping us an email on utopiananddystopianfictions@gmail.com. So Matt, here we are, season 3 of the Utopian and Dystopian Fictions podcast. And we have finally come to an agreement off camera that we're going to call them seasons and not series, because the podcast is the series and the grouping of episodes is the season. So we've come to an agreement there. How do you feel? We're back for a third season then? Happy?
I don't know why there was ever any doubt about this being. It's definitely a season, Liam. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm delighted to be back. I made the joke last time that we'd been renewed, and we've still not got any advertisers knocking on our door or anything like that, I'm afraid. So it's just sort of it was just a shame because I've been listening to podcasts and I like when you've got these kind of companies that advertise and the creativity that people can put into these adverts is really great.
Well, Matt, speaking of adverts, here's a word from today's sponsor. No, Matt, we sort of teased at the end of season 2 that we're going to have a broader theme for season 3, which was interdisciplinarity, which is a word that I always struggle with.
That's why we've chosen it. So
it's just how are we gonna throw Liam under the bus? I think it's really important for us to address, really briefly, why we wanted to have that as a focus for this season. Obviously, as you and I have confessed to at several points throughout the podcast history, we are, by and large, literary scholars. Predominantly books, but film, television, bit of video games and other games in there too. But our home turf, if you like, is literature. It is books and stories. And that is, I think, where I see dystopia and utopia as having their home. But if we just only kept it to those confines, I think we'd be doing the podcast and the genre and the audience a great disservice, right? There's so much more that's being said out there about utopias and dystopias that is adjacent to or looking at literature, but from a completely different perspective. We've got some really cool guests lined up for this season, but we're not going to give too much away right now. But I think, do you agree with me that based on who we've been chatting with, the sort of themes that we've got lined up, this could, maybe promise to be a hugely varied but, undeniably interesting season of the podcast?
Absolutely not, Liam. Don't agree with you at all. It's going to be dull. No, it's funny, because I think we are able, in the Church of Utopian Studies to really bring in all sorts of people. And I think I hadn't really realized just how varied it was until I kind of got more involved in that kind of, I suppose, that academic sphere or field, looking at things like Utopian Studies Journal and just sort of the kind of content that's being published in those spaces. And, it's interesting. This really comes through in today's interview. I think particularly just how much, although we're going to be talking about different subject matters, these people are going to be drawing on literature. Our guest today absolutely talks about her subject matter through literature. So it's not going to be that far from us, but at the same time, as you say, it's going to enrich the perspective a little bit. And I mean, when I teach utopian dystopian fiction, I kind of come at it from all of these different angles. And so it is obvious to me that as a subject area, it touches on all of these different kind of areas, history, politics, philosophy, this week's subject or our episode subject, architecture, which I actually have a week or two on when I teach the subject at degree level. So it seems evident to me, at least, that there's a lot of scope for this. And we never really kind of set, or so far we haven't, not at the beginning of the season, a set number of episodes that we're going to run for on the particular theme. So this was a kind of theme I feel might run and run, that actually we're going to keep finding new people coming forward and saying, but I teach utopia in this way, and etc. And so I'm looking forward to discovering new things. That's the part of the point as well of the podcast, for us to learn things, as well as hopefully the audience.
Yeah, it's very utopian of you. The discovery of new lands is almost something in the genre's origins there. And thank you for allaying any fears that the audience may have had. Books, we're still talking about books, folks. Don't worry, that books are still really central to what we're doing here. It's just that maybe we're going to come at them from really different angles, perspectives that we may have done previously. And again, this is not to say that previous episodes of the podcast haven't been interdisciplinary in nature either. We've had really varied discussions already. We just want to really hone in on that this time round. So Matt, who did we speak with this time round, and what did we speak with them about?
Yeah, well, I had a great time chatting to Amy Brookes, qualifying architect, associate professor in architecture at the University of Reading. And I've not met Amy before, but we had a lot of fun. I found her immensely engaging, and I think the audience will really enjoy it. Her clarity, I think she speaks with real clarity about particularly things like her love for science fiction, actually, which surprised me a little bit going in, because obviously again, this was where that sort of sense of having someone on the podcast to talk about different subject matter, but you end up still talking about science fiction books in some way, was kind of really interesting. So she talked about her love for science fiction and how it predated her interest in architecture, and it is her work on the links between architectural practice and speculative futures that drew our attention here on Utopian and Dystopian Fictions. At the beginning of the interview, Amy started by telling me how architecture doesn't necessarily offer a reflection on what values a society holds as central, but instead on what it chooses to spend its money on. In fact, throughout the interview, we kept coming back to the problems that we run into when utopian visions meet sort of embedded hierarchies and practical financing and other kind of considerations. I proposed, I think, in the interview that architecture might be seen as deterministic and as having a profound impact on human behavior, but Amy quite quickly disabused me of this notion, I think, suggesting that such an idea might be the product of the egos of certain architects who like to sort of see themselves sort of central and really important in the kind of use of those spaces. And I think instead, actually, she was sort of advocating for a vision of architecture as something that can be used in some way. It's really about kind of how spaces are used rather than what they come to represent. From there, we explored brutalism, something I suspect we might come back to in our preamble, Liam, and the centrality of kind of housing to utopian visions, i.e. the sort of clash between utopian visions of equality through shared living spaces and the often dystopian results which might well be the product of a mismanagement of spaces or other systemic inequalities rather than, say, problems with the spaces themselves. We discussed architecture in the face of crisis. Architecture, Amy notes, is a problem-solving discipline. So if you have a problem, the answer seems to be to sort of build something. But in today's environment, that itself is kind of problematized, right? So she was talking about how, the questions around how do we build ethically, or how does an ethical practice of architecture look in a moment of climate crisis in particular. We talked about the tensions in the discipline between the utopian principles of architecture, the desire to make something and thus sort of make a difference in the world, and the more practical side of design, where things like budgetary concerns run up against kind of issues to do with your imagination. And I think that led to a much broader discussion about the ability of science fiction to unshackle the imagination, which I think is absolutely central to our discussion on this podcast about interdisciplinarity. Oh no, it's got me, Liam. That word killed me there. That sort of idea that we might unshackle the imagination through this kind of fiction makes it, broadly speaking, interdisciplinary. It can apply in all these other fields, which I think is a great way of thinking about it. And but Amy spoke about her love for science fiction, how as a genre it helped her think through and beyond questions that we've already highlighted about architectural restraints. She spoke a little bit about spaces of resistance, the power of home. We kind of, towards the end, we talked a little about the future of architecture, the problems around who gets to determine what is built, and how those kind of long-term structural inequalities end up impacting what futures can be imagined. I was kind of reminded, if you like, of our discussion with Andre Carrington about this in relation to the Black Fantastic, and questions around who gets to write science fiction in the first place. And finally, we talked about the practical relationship between architectural designers, clients, and those who actually live in and occupy or use those spaces. And I'm afraid, Liam, it was another epic TBR list extender episode.
It was.
There's so many things I kind of came out of our discussion, sort of thinking I need to add that to my to be read list, and that was kind of not my intention. I think part of the intention of doing something interdisciplinary was getting away from these massive lists of fiction that we feel like we should read. So unfortunately, Amy added a bunch of new stuff to that.
But all super interesting sounding. Thanks for the summation there, Matt. A few things came to mind as you were sort of doing that. First of all, I don't know if you meant this. There's a wonderful pun in there. You said structural inequalities, and I thought that was very funny for an episode about architecture and utopia and dystopia. You're a comic genius. You don't know it.
It was absolutely not intended. None of my puns are intended for future reference. And if anyone listening to the podcast, if I've made a pun, it's entirely accidental. I have no sense of humor whatsoever.
I'm sure, no comment. I was also thinking maybe we should, because the word interdisciplinarity has just done me again, has been throwing us up. Maybe it's applied utopian studies. We might want to look at this as, it's the application of it into other areas. Because I think something that really comes across throughout Amy's discussion is sort of the place of utopianism, utopian beliefs in architecture as a profession, as a field of study, and so on. And I think she sort of suggests that the term utopian, as we've come across on several occasions, is not so much loaded, but has maybe a bit of a bad rep. It's used critically in like a negative sense rather than constructively, rather than it being a positive sort of modifier. But I think Amy was sort of suggesting that although the term might be rejected, or although it's maybe got a bit of a bad rep in the field, that there is really strong utopian thinking underpinning a lot of work happening in architecture, a lot of work being done by architects and in the sort of academic spaces related to architecture too. So that was super interesting. I think there was a lot to be said as well about maybe some of the tensions between sort of professional architecture firms under capitalism versus sort of the utopian ideals that maybe the people working for those firms uphold. She has a really great anecdote about that in the podcast that I don't want to spoil. But just a super fascinating podcast. Amy, for listening, big thanks for popping along, because it was hugely engaging.
What I think you're saying, Liam, as well, is that really we're all utopians, whether we like to admit it or not. I kind of think I always find this so strange. Like the term, you're right, it has like this stigma attached to it.
Mm.
But then, like, if you stop and say, well, do you guys like want to make the world better? Yeah, yeah, okay, of course I want a better world. Yeah, of course I want to like imagine a future that's better than than the one we currently seem to be heading towards. So those foundational principles do apply in all fields in that sense. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're not going to just talk about utopia, of course. We're also going to talk about dystopia. As we do, last season, the theme was dystopia, and we're not going to just leave it behind now. We're in season 3. I wondered whether we might talk a little bit, just as part of the preamble for the interview, about dystopian visions of architecture. So we do talk a little bit about that in the interview, but not loads. And I was thinking about, well, what sort of things do you imagine if you're imagining a dystopia? Because one of the first things that comes to my mind are the spaces that you're imagining, right?
Mm.
So maybe you might want to kick us off, Liam, on thinking about spaces that come to your mind when you think of dystopia.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. You know, I would say you stole my question because I think we both had this question in mind, but I think two spaces that really come to mind for me are the living quarters, for lack of a better word, of the protagonist in We. His sort of glass walled, glass ceiling, glass floored, living abode, where you can see what everyone's doing at any sort of point of time. And then moreover, I also think very strongly of Winston Smith's apartment in 1984. And again, I think the underlying thing there for me is surveillance, right? It's the fact that we build walls, I suppose, in theory, to keep things in or to keep things out. And if a wall is made of glass, or if a wall is dominated by an all-seeing telescreen, that is a complete corruption of what a space or what a wall is for, I suppose. Again, I don't know what that says about me. I am quite a private person. I live on my own, and I very much like living on my own. So maybe for me that's why it's so dystopian. It's the sort of safe space of one's home is not, or it's perceived constantly, and that to me is horrifying.
It's interesting because there's obviously no privacy in these dystopias you're talking about, but there's also no privacy in More's utopia, right? Everything has to be conducted in public, so it's a sort of feature of utopia and dystopia. And also, when you talk about walls, I mean, I'm minded of as a quote from Gregory Claeys, or a line from Gregory Claeys, I think in his book The Natural History of Dystopia, where he says essentially that a utopia or a utopian city is a city where the wall is there designed to keep things out, but a dystopian city the wall is designed to keep people in. And I thought, yeah, okay, absolutely. That sort of sense with utopia, you want to keep out the kind of things that might be corrupting influences, and with a dystopia, you're trying to keep the population in. In fact, they want to escape. So I don't know about you, but one of the central texts I always think about is J.G. Ballard's novel High Rise. There's a really striking. This is one of the texts I have. I don't currently teach it on my module, but I used to teach it, and I really love the novel. I sometimes struggle to get students to read it. I don't know why, but maybe it was just where it was placed in the module. I don't know. But Ned Bowman, writing in the introduction to one of the editions of his novel High Rise, which is 1975. The novel, by the way, is about a high-rise building in which the occupants gradually descend into chaos, class warfare, these kinds of things. He suggests in this introduction that Ballard, quote, imagines the power of a new architecture to transform the moral and sentimental lives of human beings. So in some senses, this being Ballard's sort of dystopian imagination, this transformation is detrimental, right? The high-rise comes to represent a new logic, anticipating perhaps the rise of sort of neoliberalism that would come to dominate the political economics of the 1980s and beyond, through sort of Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the United States. It's interesting, for instance, that Ben Wheatley, who adapted High Rise to film in 2015, ends the movie with a radio broadcast from a speech Thatcher gave to Parliament, despite the fact Thatcher wouldn't become Prime Minister until 1979, so 4 years after Ballard's novel was even published. Anyway, so Ballard's High Rise is really like the opposite, I think, of the buildings that Amy's talking about.
Mm.
You know, it is brutalist in construction, and we talk a bit about brutalism in the interview, but the core tenets of brutalism is in some way kind of idealistic, right? Emphasizing things like equality and functionality. And in High Rise, these are kind of subverted. So in High Rise, we instead get a critique of the innate structures of power and class stratification that divide the building and that therefore kind of come to mirror our society more broadly. So those who live on, I guess this is for people who haven't read the novel, those who live on the lower floors are generally poorer. Their parking spaces are further away from the buildings, they've got further to go, they have limited access to facilities, they've got slower elevators. And then when things start to go wrong, it's their amenities that suffer kind of first. Whereas the architect who designs this, and several minor celebrities, they house themselves on the top floors.
Mm.
In fact, the architect in High Rises in fact, the actual building itself is a kind of form of social experiment that the architect is sort of engaged in. And randomly, I came across this because obviously I was, doing research for teaching this several years ago. It was thought that Ballard was inspired by the experiments of John B. Calhoun in the 1960s, who famously built rat utopias. That's his term for it, was that they were rat utopias, where he provided rats with every resource that they would need, but he limited living space. So he found that the population peaked like way below his expectations. And in fact, the part of the reason was because the rats began attacking one another. So they had like plenty of resources, but they didn't have enough space, and this created this sort of tension. And so his experiments were then like often very inaccurately wheeled out and used to critique things like the social housing schemes when they failed. And I read somewhere that I think it was in a piece of journalism, actually, maybe from like a Guardian piece. I read somewhere that Ballard had apparently kept a box of mice on his television set, and so he's sort of interested in that as well. But yeah, you've read High Rise, Liam?
I have, yeah. It's again, it's one of the ones where I say I've bought it and I've read it. It's a text that I read. I didn't enjoy it so much.
What?
Yeah, sorry. So I know you're sort of saying that your students did too. It's like, yeah, kind of.
It's
I
a
relate.
great novel. Go on.
But I think that Amy was discussing, I think in the interview, that High Rises generally can be conceived as a utopian space in that the flats and apartments are identical. Right, there's a uniformity there. There's an equality there. And I suppose, yeah, as you were saying, in Ballard's novel, that is completely subverted in that there is a clear hierarchy, and the hierarchy is very clearly linear, vertically, in the structure of the building. The people lowered on the lower floors have, as I said, poorer amenities and poorer access, and so on and so forth. I found it very interesting as a sort of reflection on dystopia and space. I just think narratively it sort of fell a bit flat for me. Ultimately, I just didn't know why I just didn't leave the High Rise when things were going bad. I just don't get why they just didn't leave. But maybe that's the point, right? Maybe that's the point of like, it's
the seduction to it.
Yeah,
it's a seduction to the chaos, right?
So maybe
I actually like it because you can also kind of turn it upside down. I think there's an energy in High Rise that arises, if you like, from the way in which the residents essentially tear down the power structures and begin to find new ways to live. So, I've talked about this before, like my mission on the module is always to like read these horrible dystopian texts and tell the students really they are kind of utopian in some way. And this was a perfect example for this because it opens with the protagonist eating a dog. It's a really horrible image that it starts with. But then, in some ways, this is about the kind of breaking down of kind of the rules and regulations of kind of a corporatized society and discovering something new. So particularly in the end of the novel, which I won't kind of spoil for anyone who hasn't read it. And it also sort of made me think of what's a really great movie in my view, which is Bong Joon-ho's Snowpiercer.
Yep. Yep.
which also plays with ideas about
Yep.
sort of the stratification of these kinds of spaces along class lines, but it's set on a train rather than in a high rise, and also happens to have that kind of Margaret Thatcher type figure
Yep.
played
Yep.
by Tilda Swinton,
Yep.
who sort of looms over the movie's action. And by your response, I'm guessing you liked Snowpiercer.
I love Snowpiercer. Yeah, I was thinking about it. Speaking about high rise, that it's the train Snowpiercer in Snowpiercer is in essence Ballard's high rise toppled. You know, like there's a very...
I don't know if you've seen the TV show at all.
Yep.
But there's a line, I think it's maybe in like the third episode or something, that says a train is really like a high rise on its side or something. I was like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
they've obviously been reading Ballard.
Yeah.
So yeah, I thought that was a little kind of Easter egg for us kind of dystopian scholars out there.
Yeah, no, I love Snowpiercer. Love Snowpiercer. I have the graphic novels, but in typical me fashion, haven't read them.
So again, I sort of said on the module I teach that I do kind of a couple of weeks. I do a kind of dystopia and architecture, or dystopia in space, in which actually I teach Snowpiercer at the moment. That's in that slot which I previously had Ballard on. But I also teach a kind of follow-up week about, well, what does utopian architecture look like? So I know Amy and I sort of talked about this a little bit in the interview, but I didn't get a chance. I don't know why it just didn't come up to talk about the one text I really love that sort of deals with this, which is Italo Calvino's really lovely experimental little novella called Invisible Cities. And I'm not sure how many people will be familiar with it who listen to it. I think some people will be. It's not that obscure, but I also don't think it's that well known either. And I would absolutely encourage everyone to read it. It's about 150 pages, but like every page is like half a page. So really it reads as about sort of 75, 80 pages. So it's quite short, but it is absolutely packed full of wonderful, beautiful description, lovely ideas. And I think it's right at the other end of the scale. You know, I tried to think a bit about what a utopian form of architecture would look like. And I personally think it's an inspiring sort of vision of that. It's published in 1972, so quite similar sort of time period to when Ballard's writing. But in it, Calvino imagines a series of conversations between a traveler, Marco Polo, very famous traveler, and Emperor Kublai Khan in the 13th century. And Kublai Khan at this point is an aging emperor, and he's seeking to understand his empire. It's an empire that's far-flung. So the Mongols during this time had the largest land empire in history. So as an emperor sort of sitting over this extent of space, how do you kind of come to terms with it as a whole? And he's kind of looking for this kind of unified understanding of his empire. And this is sort of contrasted really nicely with the sort of mercantile Venetian Marco Polo, who is sort of recounting to him all of these places in his empire that he's supposedly visited. And Calvino's architectural imagination is heterogeneous, it's fragmentary, but it's characterized primarily by lightness. And I don't mean lightness as in the quality of kind of, visual light. I'm talking about lightness as in, immaterialism, dematerialized space. So in some ways, it is, again, I would suggest like the opposite of the great brutalist structures that we were talking about, those sort of heavy, uniform structures, which often in our imagination seem so oppressive. For me, Calvino kind of offers like its counterpoint. So Letitia Moderna has written that, quote, as a new form of utopian literature, Invisible Cities was intended to be an impetus for original and unconventional visions of the city and society. To that end, it engages with planners, designers, and theorists who are debunking the classical conceptualization of utopia and approaching it instead as an exercise in imagining lateral possibilities or alternatives to the world as they knew it. So kind of almost in like the reverse direction, I suppose, of what Amy's doing in terms of, Amy is a kind of architect being inspired by literature. Here we've got kind of literature that is, fundamentally engaging with those people designing things, and is sort of meant for that purpose. And in fact, much like we're trying to do with this podcast, Liam, Letitia Modena also writes that, quote, Calvino was reading across the disciplines to understand the relations between utopia and the imagination, approaching utopia as a cognitive and imaginative exercise for the present rather than a futuristic fantasy. And that's the line I think that really speaks to the kind of tenor of my interview with Amy, right?
Totally. The idea of utopian, dystopian fiction, or speculative fiction more broadly, unlocking imaginations, enabling us to tackle problems in these sort of different areas, subjects, topics, fields, and be able to attack them with new energy, new ideas, new understanding is something that comes across in your chat with Amy for sure. And is something that I'm sure we will see, knowing some of the episodes we've got lined up, likewise manifest in other fields as well. So speaking of Amy's interview and imagination, I'm sure the audience's imagination is running wild, wants to know exactly what it is that Amy has to say. So how about we pass over to past version of you and Amy and the chat that you have.
I'm delighted to introduce to you our guest today, Amy Brookes. Amy, could you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Yeah, hi, I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm Amy. I'm a qualified architect, and I'm also an associate professor in architecture at the University of Reading. And my specialism is looking at representations of the built environment in speculative fiction. I'm really fascinated by the ways in which we imagine the world and how that has a response to our lived experience and perhaps suggests alternative futures for us.
That's brilliant. And we're sort of in this particular season, if you like, we're reaching out, I think, to sort of a wider range of scholars. I've been sort of struck by how broad the sort of Church of Utopian Studies is. And Liam and I, we're kind of primarily literary scholars. So, we're interested in film, television, etc., games. But I know from doing a little bit of teaching in sort of this area, I think I teach 1 week or maybe 2 weeks on my utopian dystopian fiction module on sort of a link between kind of architecture and utopia and dystopia as well. So I kind of know it is an area where there's these really interesting intersections. And so I wondered, with that in mind, Amy, would you tell us something about how maybe the buildings we design and occupy in some ways speak maybe more broadly to what we believe about society, its values, these kinds of issues?
Yeah, absolutely. Start off with a small question.
I was thinking that as I was looking at my questions, like, this is a bit of a biggie, but yeah, why not?
No, it's
Why
absolutely fine. So absolutely, architecture is a reflection of social value. I think within kind of Western society, particularly within the UK context that I'm speaking from, it's a predominantly reflection of where we choose to spend money, rather than necessarily the things that we as a society might value. So if we would look around at the kind of most significant architectural projects, ones that we're probably most familiar with would be city high-rises, significant housing developments, things like that. We perhaps would not see the investment in community infrastructure more significantly, even though that is something that we as a society, I hope anyway, value very deeply. So I think for me, architecture is really, it is an incredibly value-driven profession, but it's one which is mired in the structures of capitalism, particularly when buildings are such a significant financial outlay. Having said that, I think that there are really kind of wonderful moments for utopian reflection through architecture. And for me, it really comes down to how architecture is inhabited as much as how it is designed. So there's some wonderful thinking about architecture being a social practice. So it's not just the built fabric of the thing, it is how we choose to inhabit it and how we choose to use it. There's a lovely section from A Door into Ocean, which kind of springs into mind when I think about architecture as practice. And that's a novel by Joan Slonczewski, which follows the inhabitants of a purely ocean world as they kind of encounter land-based civilizations for the first time. And one of their inhabitants visits the city, and she is there to try and understand why people are coming to her world to mine resources. And as she's walking through this city, she sees the surfaces of walls covered in hundreds of tiny mosaic tiles. And she becomes really aware of both the enormous labor which has gone into this, the time that people have spent putting this together, the cost of it that is a kind of more than financial cost, that is a material cost, that is a human cost, and the way that that speaks to the power of the person who owns that, and that they have those kinds of resources at their disposal. And then she talks about the way it reflects light and how that prevents people from entering, how it is a barrier of wealth, how it's a barrier of privilege. And she talks about it being the surface of the ground as well, having this same kind of mirrored tiled finish, and people walking over it and troops marching over it, and how the footsteps of the troops have polished this to this high sheen. So it's the practice of power which has then transformed the architecture. It's polished it up, it's made it more impenetrable, it's made it denser. And she reflects on how perhaps it's also made the soles of the feet of the people who are marching harder. It's hardened them to the world as well. So there's this wonderful kind of reciprocal relationship between the symbolic expression of architecture, which I think a lot of us are quite attuned to, the kind of hidden labours of architecture, its cost in ways which are more than monetary, and then the ways in which we practice it, the ways in which we could transform it, but the ways it transforms us back, kind of all happening within that moment, which I think is just so powerful.
I mean, I said before we had this interview that I'm terrible for going off piste and divert, going way off from my questions. And yeah, that's such a great answer. You've already got me thinking about a million and one things. So I'm already going to take us away from my second question I was going to ask. But I mean, that brought to mind so many different things. I'm now kind of thinking about these spaces which I think are kind of dystopian in nature. I'm thinking about things like brutalist architecture, which also is kind of celebrated in some quarters, I'm sure. But and then what people do, but it's your point, I think, largely is also it's what people do with that space. And sometimes these kind of horrible spaces in some way can inspire community, can inspire artistic response. I'm thinking about kind of like graffiti, for example, as a response to a kind of ugly environment and an attempts to beautify it in some way, or speak to the individual in a kind of otherwise oppressive kind of landscape. And then I'm also thinking about kind of concrete kind of jungles, if you like, but I'm thinking about that kind of combination of the concrete jungle and the actual jungle, where people might sort of have a really kind of concrete space but put lots of potted plants in it. I don't, so where you can kind of transform the space in your own, and maybe then part of architectural design is about giving people a blank canvas rather than over determining like how you want them to persist in that space. I don't know, is that fair?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question about how much control architecture has over behavior. There are several kind of much maligned theorists who believed that architecture was a kind of deterministic factor in people's behavior. And there are certainly a lot of architects who would like to believe that for our own egos. But yeah, absolutely, that is not the case. There are always cracks in the world machine. And you spoke there a little bit about brutalist architecture, and I think when we're thinking about architecture and utopianism, these kind of questions of housing in particular are really present in our discourse, particularly in the UK. in the idea of after the Second World War, the kind of necessity for mass housing to replenish stocks which had been depleted and destroyed in the Blitz in particular. And that at that particular moment, there was this incredible investment in social architecture in a way which we have never seen again. And that local councils were empowered to build on a vast scale, and that they were particularly entranced by ideas of modernism, which were emerging across Europe. And the idea in a lot of those high-rise structures was that it would be a space of absolute spatial equality, that there would be, everybody would have the same kind of flat. There would be no hierarchy, that everybody would have access to light, to green space. So they come from these astounding utopian ideals about what could be provided for everyone. And it's kind of, it's one of the kind of great, great losses, I think, of architectural history, that those ideals were then kind of let down in a lot of ways by the construction quality of a lot of places, but also in some sense by the hubris of some individual designers who perhaps felt like they were able to determine what people would need in a very paternalistic way that didn't understand the nuances of individual people's lives. So the kind of rise and fall of the housing estate is a kind of wonderful example of the kind of utopian intention of architecture, and then its dystopian perception, which is in main because of the ways those buildings were maintained, because of the fact that they became seen as problem places to live. So certain people were unable to leave or were moved in. So that created hierarchies where they hadn't existed before. So again, it comes back to this idea of both the kind of physical space of the building and what that makes possible, this kind of idea of egalitarian understandings of space, but also then its lived practice. One of my kind of favorite examples of that is the the Barbican housing estate in London, which is an absolute kind of concrete fortress. It's not a social housing project, it's privately owned, and contains art centres, museums, gallery space, fantastic music venues. So it's a real example of how those same physical structures, when they are maintained, when they are supported with social infrastructure, can be incredibly desirable places to live. So it's not necessarily that the material has this kind of brutal quality to it. It's an association, I think, but it's one which is so deeply entrenched, it's really difficult to unpick.
This is music to my ears. I'll front up and say that I used to, I don't teach it currently on the module. I used to teach High Rise by J.G. Ballard, which of course is kind of all about, brutalism, and one of my missions is always on that module to try to convince students that the thing that they think is highly dystopian actually has these kind of utopian qualities, underlying it. And so what you're saying here, I mean, it's a difficult one. It's a novel that opens with the protagonist eating his dog, or a dog. I don't think it's necessarily his dog, but eating a dog. So and then I sort of say, but there are these kind of utopian threads running through this. I remember some years ago, I think, watching a really interesting documentary about Pruitt-Igoe in the US, which I would thoroughly recommend. It's a really interesting story about kind of just what you're saying, really, that idea of the kind of utopian idealism of these kind of social housing projects, and then their kind of pretty much their kind of descent into ruin in some capacity in a lot of cases. Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by that. But we've massive. I mean, we're just so far away from the questions I lined up now. But actually, maybe we could get this back on track. So you were very kind enough to send me a paper that I'd say you've been working, but it's coming out. It's polished and finished, and it's called "Held in Common: Science Fiction and Collective Spaces." And in that, you make, I think, several bold statements. But right in the beginning, you say, as an architect, that you note that your job involves the building of walls. But you say, I quote, "The world is on fire, and our walls do not shelter us." So, I guess that's that question. What is the value of kind of architecture, walls in particular, in a world that we're living in right now? So I wonder if you might say a little bit about what you were kind of intending with that statement.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, that's really speaking to one of several crises that I see architecture going through at the moment. As a discipline, we are kind of trained to believe that the answer to any given question is a building. That if you have a problem, that's okay, we'll build you a new space and that will solve it. And we're having to confront the fact that as we kind of begin to understand the implications of climate emergency in an ever more pervasive way, we can no longer build our way out of this crisis. That the practice of architecture and the building of new buildings in particular consumes enormous quantities of resources. It requires processes of extraction, material relocation, labor. And that's not even taking into account the kind of possible demolition of existing structures and the waste that's associated with that, or the dislocation of people and place. So as a profession, we're really having to grapple with this idea that building something new is not the way that we are able to solve these more existential problems which we are facing globally. And instead, we need to kind of reinvent our profession in a certain way to think about how we might reuse what we already have, how we might build in ways which are less environmentally detrimental, but also about how we might use the tools of architecture, the kind of ways of thinking about space, the ways of kind of making together, which happens throughout every architectural project where you work on huge teams, how we might be able to use some of those skills to support alternative ways of living within the world as it is, to perhaps challenge some of the root causes of environmental crisis.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm hoping that the term for this is unbuilding, because it feels like it's got to be in there
Yeah.
somewhere. But
Yeah,
is that
it
a term
is.
you've come across?
Yeah, absolutely it is. Yeah. And that term's kind of used across a few different ways. There's a really wonderful article by Jack Halberstam which talks about unbuilding gender, which particularly uses the artworks and practices of Gordon Matta Clark, who was an artist who used to cut these huge voids into existing buildings and use those as kind of ways of opening up a building to the street, but also kind of questioning the fabric of something. So Halberstam uses that very architectural spatial practice to begin to think about how we might unpick ideas of similarly kind of fixed ideas or seemingly fixed ideas like conceptions of gender, but also how we might begin to think about how we reconfigure society in various different ways. And it's something which a huge number of architects are engaged in. There's recent publication, particularly by Mold Collective, called Architecture is Climate, which makes kind of similarly bold claims that we cannot divorce the practice of architecture from its social and climate implications. They are one and the same, and to kind of deny that is to perpetuate and exacerbate the situations that we find ourselves in.
Is there a sense that we were talking before we started recording? You were saying that there was quite a preponderance of people who had come into academia from architectural design sort of spaces, and and that it was quite a common move to make, which, you know, given the current state of HE in the country, sort of seems startling that you would go from a job where you were actually building buildings to wanting to talk about building buildings. But I mean, in that, I was wondering about, well, is there a kind of lot of utopians in that sort of thing? You know, people that fundamentally think that architecture or architectural design is utopian, and then they kind of run up against the realities of it, perhaps when they are in it, and they kind of want to, no, actually, maybe I want to talk about the principles of it. You know, I going back to your piece, you write each project is founded on the belief that it will remake the world in some small way. So there's a kind of a natural link between kind of utopianism and you know, architectural design. At the same time, though, there's also this kind of strand of architectural study which I would imagine is rooted in the practical, the making concrete, if you like. And utopianism is often kind of critiqued or attacked as being impractical, unrealistic, right? So, you know, there's a tension there, and I'm just wondering, like, you know, are you someone who is like different from other people working in this field, or you tend to represent, you know, the dominant strand of thinking about architecture as utopian in some capacity?
Yeah, I think in part because of the kind of legacies of modernism, there are a lot of architects who resist calling themselves utopian because it comes with this idea of being kind of didactic or egotistical, and perhaps there's this idea of hubris associated with it. So it's a term which isn't used very commonly across architectural education. Some kind of notable exceptions might be Nathaniel Coleman's work. But I feel like it is one which is something which we do at our hearts believe. I think otherwise, why else would you go into architecture if you didn't believe that the things that you were designing or building would have a change in the world? And I have to hope that people would think they would be a positive change. So I feel like it is very utopian at its heart. I think perhaps the rarer quality is for people to acknowledge that, and also to engage with the kind of truly speculative nature of utopian thinking, beyond it being a kind of predictive mode. So there's a scholar, Amy Bang, who talks in Migrant Future about the texts which undertake a kind of radical unfurling rather than simply attempting to predict a continuation of existing events. So I certainly see that there are quite a few architectural schools and scholars and who are still grappling with this question of how do we practice architecture in a way which is not just a continuation of existing conditions? How do we undertake those kind of more radical leaps into alternative futures? And from that position, how might we then imagine what needs to change within the present? And for me, that's really where utopian studies and utopian thinking is incredibly valuable. You know, we can think about Frederick Dramerson celebrating science fiction's capacity to relax the tyrannical reality principle, which flattens realist fiction and kind of makes alternative versions of the world possible to imagine. So it becomes a place where it's possible to imagine an escape from pervasive structures like capitalism. And for me, that's a kind of undervalued quality within architectural education and architectural practice, a kind of willingness to engage in those less plausible, perhaps more imaginative futures, and to see their value as a form of practice that allows us to step out of ourselves and to challenge what we consider to be everyday reality or the kind of the state of the given world.
I'm looking at my next question, and I'm thinking I sound really like some sort of kind of horrible politician that I would be absolutely throwing a shoe at the TV or whatever if they came on. But I mean, this is tied to what you're saying here, which is that, you know, as an architect, but also a utopian, how do you confront problems presented by realism, practicality, and in particular financial restraint. I note, for example, in your piece, you talked a lot about emphasizing the importance of common land against things like private ownership. But does that mean that really, realistically, I'm using air quotes here, we can't really actually engage with that until we do something about the way in which we, organize society, right? It's about reconfiguring the way we think about architectural spaces rather than being able to do something in the here and now. I don't know. Or do you still have like hope that this can be like something we can put into practice and action right away, that we don't have to rely on some other kind of government being voted in that's going to totally transform this space first? What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, I am determinedly hopeful. I see kind of no other way of being. And I think, again, this is a kind of question that I find science fiction incredibly helpful when I'm grappling with it. First of all, it helps me kind of understand the scale of the problems that we're confronting. So I really enjoy thinking through New York 2140 by Kim Stanley Robinson, which looks at a very near future where New York has flooded. And what I think is really valuable about this particular book, and I particularly enjoy, is that there has been a kind of minor shake-up in the stock markets, but in essence, capitalism has continued undisturbed. Instead, there are now just new trading futures on foreshore land, for example. So through that text, he kind of posits that even the kind of notional end of the world, the apocalypse, will not stop these structures from persisting. They will find ways to adapt. So we collectively need to undertake that work. We cannot rely on any kind of external factors to transform the world for us. And I think that's also really important to think through in relation to Indigenous futures. I'm thinking about Grace Dillon's amazing collection, Walking the Clouds, and the kind of scholarship behind that, particularly by Carl White, who talks about Indigenous groups having already endured many apocalypses. That climate catastrophe might seem to some people from an incredibly privileged and sheltered background like myself to be a singular apocalypse, but it is not. And instead, how we might look to Indigenous storytelling, in particular, to think about questions of survivance and flourishing, how we can continue to exist and create new worlds and break open new possibilities, even within these oppressive structures. And to me, they then speak to architectural practices which are operating at a much smaller scale. We're thinking about how do we create these kind of moments of possibility, these kind of openings within seemingly impenetrable systemic structures like land ownership. So we might think about practices like there's a lovely project called Our Urban, which was looking at using unused space within, I think it was Cologne, as allotments and community spaces, and they erected a lot of temporary structures there, that they were then displaced because the city council wanted to sell that land to be a car park, of all things.
This is so utopian, right? Yeah.
It's so dystopian you couldn't even write it. But to me, I think there's an incredibly value in those small places and practices, because they have a cumulative value. They speak to the possibility. They kind of hold open these spaces of hope. And that also, to me, speaks to things like Bell Hooks's idea of home place. And she was talking about the resistance strategies within the US with groups who were resisting enslavement. And the importance of home for those people as a site of resistance, because it was a space outside of those oppressive structures. And even though those spaces were incredibly small, they were domestic spaces, they were fraught with all kinds of issues of domestic labor and kind of gender imbalance. But they were, from those places, it was then possible to overthrow a seemingly intractable system of ownership of other people. And I really kind of see that as a kind of an astounding example of how these small spaces and places can have extraordinary power.
It sounds more like it's kind of adaptation than revolution, but
Mm-hmm.
actually you were kind of at the end there, I think, sort of saying that maybe the one can lead to the other as well, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Another kind of recent text which I've really loved is Everything for Everyone, an oral history of the New York Commune 2052 to 2072, which is a fantastically long title, by M. E. O'Brien and M. Adalhabi. And that's written as if it's a series of oral histories from a near future. And it really kind of dwells on the lived experiences of numerous people through various different revolutions. So there's a whole chapter that talks about revolutions in sex work, revolutions across the Levant, in higher education spaces, in space travel, and that these are kind of all happening simultaneously within this future. But they're all happening through the kind of small scale reappropriation of existing structures, the coming together of existing groups of people. So none of them is made possible because of a significant kind of governmental change. Instead, they are all acts of revolution which are kind of founded on everyday behaviors. Which is not to say that I believe that there is no place for pushing for governmental change. I think that that is incredibly important for our collective continued existence, because those kinds of large existing structures do wield enormous power. And so it is within their capacity to be able to transform or kind of implement regulatory change or social investment, which would have enormous impact. I am just slightly wary or pessimistic about whether or not we can rely on that alone.
Whether it's going to happen in time, yeah, maybe.
Exactly. Yeah.
You're talking, well, you've spoken already quite a bit about literature, so it's obvious that
Mm,
you see a kind of a, an overlap there, and you're interested in
mm.
that. So I wondered if you might say a little bit about that. So you encourage, again, in the same piece that I'm talking about. When is that coming out, by the way? Do you know?
Hopefully very soon. Yes,
I'm
it's gone
hoping,
through
it,
proofing,
it
so
might be out, by the time we air the podcast. But anyway, it's coming out soon. If it is out, we'll put a link to it in the description, or we can always revisit the description later on when it
mm.
is out, because it's a really good piece. But you in particular encourage other architects to turn to science fiction for inspiration. You're sort of speaking to them and saying you've obviously found something valuable in it. So I wondered if you might talk a little bit more about what you've taken from science fiction as inspiration.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's kind of hard to link it particularly to architectural practice because my love of science fiction predates my love of architecture by several decades. Um, so it's really been something which I have always been incredibly passionate about. And uh, the moment when I realized that I might be able to write about science fiction as part of my architectural education was a day of great joy for me. Um, so one of the things that I particularly get from science fiction is this kind of radical break from the lived everyday. And I cannot understate the value of that for me. It's it's something which I see echoed in the work of a lot of literary theorists and activists as well. So people like Walida Imarisha, who in the introduction to Octavia's Brood talks about the necessity of unshackling the imagination as a place from which all other forms of liberation can be born. And for me personally, it's that unshackling of imagination which then makes other forms of design possible, which are imaginative acts. So I see science fiction writers as people who are kind of imagining alongside those of us working in the other creative professions, and that we have a huge amount to share with one another and to learn from one another. I think the other thing that science fiction has given me, and which I'm immensely grateful for, is the communities of scholars and readers that I have come to know through those texts, who have become, in some cases, my dearest friends. And so I would think about, I've had the privilege to be part of Beyond Gender, which is a research collective oriented around representations of gender in speculative fiction. And I've been able to work alongside scholars from sort of all of the humanities and arts disciplines and learn from them. And that's been made possible because of science fiction, which acted as this shared space between all of us, that we could kind of meet within the strange worlds of a science fiction text, and through that begin to share things which were of value or of use to one another. And so I think for me, that's really been the kind of great gift has been community. And I should also mention the Co-Futures group, who are going to be editing the journal issue, which this article will be part of. And it's an issue of the Journal of Architecture, which is quite a traditional architectural journal. So the fact that that group has managed to kind of find a space within that to bring together people who are interested in these alternative or possible futures and the stories that they might tell, I think is a fantastic gift that they've given to scholars like myself. So it's really science fiction worlds themselves, but also the communities they build between them.
That's really heartening to hear that it's sort of is a thing that sort of bridges these kind of divides. Just picking up on something else you said there, I also noted that elsewhere in your work you've talked about the sort of link between architecture, power, and identity in some capacity. And as someone who's, I was suggest somewhat naive to this, I wondered if you might say a little bit about the politics of architecture on that practical level. Like, is there a question mark here about who is actually determining what architectural visions are brought to life, and how do we sort of push back against that? Because isn't that also sort of that embedded structure that's gonna end up determining what the future of architecture looks like? But how do we kind of maybe work towards a more egalitarian future in the field of architectural studies or architectural design?
Yeah, it is an incredibly complex question to work through, and something which most architects are grappling with. And I would say, kind of referring back to your earlier question about people moving into academia or undertaking architectural studio design teaching alongside their practice, I think a lot of those people are individuals who are interested in asking these bigger questions about what the future of architecture might be, and how it solidifies and structuralizes existing systems of power, and then how we might also use that to transfer power if possible. So yeah, absolutely, it is an incredibly pressing question for us, and ways to kind of resist it, I think, as ever, there's collective action. So we might look at collectives like ACAN, the Architects Climate Action Network, or Architects Declare Climate Emergency, which is a group where practices have voluntarily signed up to a charter of how they will or will not practice. And quite notably, Foster and Partners, which was at the time the largest architecture firm in the UK, signed up to the Architects Declare Climate Emergency, and then proceeded to build an airport. And there was sort of outrage within the architectural community that however sustainably you design an airport, however much you use reclaimed timber and make it incredibly energy efficient, it supports a kind of industry which is responsible for a huge amount of climate damage. So can you say that you are interested in climate futures if you are undertaking that kind of work? They obviously pushed back and said they designed it in the most green way possible, but they actually had to remove themselves from this signatory list quite ignominiously because of the outcry around it. So I think there are possibilities of kind of collective change that can hold power to account in certain ways. But I also think, again, it kind of comes down a lot to the questions of how we inhabit spaces and whether it's possible to seize these structures of power. So I'm thinking a little bit about Nola Hopkinson's wonderful novel Brown Girl in the Ring, which is set in Toronto. And there's the CN Tower in the centre of Toronto. And it exists in a near future where Toronto has become a kind of hotbed of crime, and that the middle classes have rapidly left, and it's kind of fenced off from the outside world. And so the CN Tower, which was this symbol of civic prosperity, of kind of capitalist growth, is then occupied by a gang boss who uses it as a symbol of his own personal power and control. And then later on in the novel, the protagonist is able to use her own kind of inherited traditions and practices to kind of summon spirits from the ground and from the earth to reoccupy this tower. And it becomes this totem which channels alternative forms of knowing and power. And I really love that moment in the book, because it speaks to the importance of how we choose to inhabit or choose to understand architecture, and whether it's possible to use those patterns and practices to kind of repurpose these existing structures to serve new ends, to serve new communities.
Amy, when Liam and I were thinking about this new series, and we sort of went down the interdisciplinary route, I think partly we didn't say this to each other, but partly we did it because we thought our to be read lists needed a break. And you're somehow, I think you've thrown out more literary recommendations in text than anyone we've had on the podcast to date. So that hasn't worked for me. But
so
that's great.
sorry.
No, really, really pleasing to hear this. But my Goodreads now is wincing in pain. So yeah, I mean, I'm sort of getting towards thinking about a broader picture of this. And I'm sure this is almost certainly too ambitious as a kind of question, but it strikes me that when you're thinking about architecture, design, etc., from an outside perspective at least, you're covering so many things. You're thinking about the building of homes, you're thinking about estates, large civic buildings, urban planning as a whole. How do you bring all these kind of scales together? Is there kind of like, I suppose, like an overarching principles that you can apply across these different areas that might speak to kind of utopian ideals, or is that sort of is it all very atomized?
It is quite atomized, but I think the principles that I take from kind of utopian studies are around working kind of with people who will be inhabiting these buildings, which is unfortunately not as common as you might think. Architects tend to, so it's a massive generalization, there is a model of architectural practice where you are employed by the client, who is the person who is funding the building, and that is not necessarily the person who will be occupying it. And so the priorities of architectural projects get determined by the funder. So actually kind of undertaking engagement with people who will be using or inhabiting those spaces is a kind of foundational shift that architects strive for, but is often very fraught. And so I think I take that from kind of utopian studies, along with the idea of then working with those communities to think about not only the issues which they are currently working through, but also the possible or imagined futures that they would want to see, and to try and think about how an architectural project might be a step towards that, or might be something which can begin to realize some aspects of that. And I think really that is a utopian practice in a lot of ways. So I might think about the work of Muff Architecture Art, who are a practice who work primarily in public realm works, so designing sort of streetscapes, parks, things like that, who do fantastic engagement practices, asking people to kind of not only comment on existing designs that they've made, but also really kind of get involved in determining what those proposals should be. Or Resolve Collective, who say that they do a practice which they call deep hanging out, which is to go into communities and simply kind of be there for an extended period of time, to go to the barbershop, to sit in the cafe, and to try as much as it is possible for someone who is outside of a community to understand the lived experiences and concerns of that place, and then from that develop a proposal which may or may not be a building, and is more often than not something which is a minor shift in the usage of a place, or a kind of opening up of something which had already existed. So I think for me, that's really the kind of crux of a practice of architecture, which can span any scale, is this question of who is it actually for, and how do we begin to meaningfully have conversations about architectural futures?
I did genuinely think that was an ambitious question, but your answer is so convincing that that sounds like a great idea as well. Really experiencing a place from inside and as you say, I think a lot of these things, they almost sound like things where when you say them, it's like, well, yeah, obviously you would want to do that, but as you say, it's so often probably not the starting point for these kinds of projects. This has been great. I'm kind of interested. Obviously, I've just read the piece you've got coming out soon, or now, depending on when it comes out. But is there something else that you're currently working on that you want to tell us about?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I'm also working on a project which is called Speculative Space, which looks at bringing science fiction texts into galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, which are really joyfully within academia called GLAM spaces. It's a fabulous acronym. And I'm working with a colleague of mine at Southampton University, Megan de Bourne-Moll, who does a lot of work around Gothic fiction, and is a fantastic artist and educator in art. And so we're working with artists, curators, science fiction scholars, going into various different institutions and thinking through how we might use speculative fiction, but also practices of creative making, to kind of open up otherwise impenetrable problems. So, for example, we did a session at the Women's Art Library where we were working with Ruth Beale, who's an artist, and Ibi Ahmed, who's a science fiction scholar and also theorist around drag performance, and we were using science fiction texts, but also the detritus of the archive itself. So all of their waste paper, all of their offcuts. And we sat around together as a group of about 15 of us, and we made accessories that might be worn in a performance of the end of the archive. And we were using that to think about the archive as a refuge for both people and objects, to think through ideas of how we might document performance, but also queer lives within archives. So we've run 7 of these workshops so far. We have joyfully just been given funding for another 3, and hopefully an exhibition of that work. So if there is anyone who's listening who has an interest in the kind of curation practices, in exhibitionary work, in these kind of questions of the kind of existential questions of what a museum or a gallery or an archive should be, or has an interest in sitting and making something really strange for an hour, or talking about science fiction, we would really love to hear from you. We're trying to build a community around this work where we can start to use these kind of perhaps more imaginative and eccentric methods to address really critical issues.
We'll put your contact details in the description. Yeah, brilliant. I mean, it sounds like a lot of fun. I can sort of see why, a lot of architects are kind of drawn back into that academic, research space, as you say, if you get to do all these fun kind of things. Thanks, Amy. This has been both really sort of eye-opening, fascinating for me, but also just a lot of fun to chat to you. So as a sign off, we always ask our guests to tell our audience of a text. Could be novel, movie, piece of criticism. I mean, you've already given us a lot already, but your own work excluded, although of course you should absolutely read your work as well. But yeah, maybe in this case, perhaps something for someone looking to think more about the connection between architecture and utopia. Have you got a kind of reading recommendation for people?
Oh, it's so hard to pick one. I really struggled with this question. It's an interesting one because I have 2 recommendations. I'm sorry.
Okay, it's fine. I mean, I've lost track of the number of people we've given two options for. So yeah, go on, abuse the system.
I will. So the first is the recommendation that I give to architects and people within the spatial disciplines who are interested in science fiction, and that is Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, which is a kind of classic of the genre.
Everyone should read that, right?
Everyone should read it.
Even if you're not interested in architecture, you should read it.
Yeah. And for me, it talks about how you have obviously the capitalist planet and the anarcho-communist moon, and then it talks about how those 2 different societies might interact, but also hints at the kind of spatial and built structures that might exemplify those particular systems. So on the moon, you have entirely kind of low-rise dwellings, housing is collectivized. And then on the capitalist planet, you have these overwhelming shopping centres, these educational establishments which are impenetrable to the outsider. And so for me, I think it's a really helpful one for architects who are thinking about, why would I be interested in science fiction? And it kind of gives them a way of understanding how it might allow you to reflect on the social and political implications of the built structures you encounter. My second recommendation, which is just for anyone and everyone, is Octavia's Brood, the collection of short stories, which is subtitled Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements. And that's a collection of short stories which were written, some of them by science fiction authors, but some of them by activists. And they are using science fiction as a tool to think about abolitionist futures, to think about social futures free of poverty, to think through kind of questions of revolution. And I find it really fascinating because it speaks to the value of these practices of imagination. And they are both wonderful stories, incredibly inspiring and moving stories. But I think they're also amazing practices in imagining alternative possibilities for the way that we currently live. So I find it a really revelatory one to work through.
Brilliant. You've really sold that to me, certainly. So thanks so much, Amy. Really enjoyed that this chat, and yeah, definitely check out Amy's work. And thanks again for coming on.
Oh, it's been an absolute joy. And my apologies for the extended reading list, but it's truly the only way I can think.
I'm sure people will welcome it. It really, deep down inside, it brings them joy. Thanks very much, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you to Amy for coming onto the podcast. Her discussion has really opened my eyes to the utopian potential of architecture, and to how reading utopian and dystopian fiction with the built environment in mind is itself a utopian move, for it alerts us to different and maybe better possibilities. If you enjoyed this episode, you can let us know by rating and following the podcast, leaving a comment, or sending us an email on utopiananddystopianfictions@gmail.com. And of course, if you really like this episode, please do join us next time, where we will delve into some more utopian and dystopian fictions.